The cry was faint, like smoke curling on the breeze, the kind that slips past reason and strikes deep into the soul. Amos Whitfield heard it just as he was securing the cinch on his horse that morning. Yet sound so raw and primal it stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or a calf, but something much smaller, something starved for warmth and tenderness. Drawn by the sound, Amos moved toward the far edge of his ranch, his boots sinking into the damp earth with each step. There, partially obscured by a tangle of sagebrush, lay a child no bigger than his saddlebags. She was a patchy thing, no more than 5 years old, her ribs jutting painfully through the tattered remnants of her dress, and her lips cracked, parched from thirst. Her eyes met his, hollow and empty, as though they'd seen too much hunger and far too little kindness. For a long moment, Amos stood frozen, as still as a boulder in the path, torn between the gut instinct that screamed for caution and the ache of a memory that was hard to forget. The land had taught him to be wary of strangers, as especially the smallest of them. Yet, in that moment, the ghost of his own hunger as a boy surged within him, a gnawing emptiness that had once been met with indifference. The memory rushed back like a flood, and before he could stop it, his hand moved. He dug into his saddlebag, pulling out a strip of jerky. The girl grabbed it from his hand, tearing into it so hungrily that she nearly choked. Amos crouched low, offering her more, gentler this time, until the tremble in her hands lessened and her eyes began to flicker with the faintest spark of relief. He lifted her, cradling her as though she weighed no more than a feather, and carried her to the porch of his cabin, her small body curled against his chest, fragile and worn, like a bird too weary to take flight. He placed her carefully on a blanket by the door before heading inside to start a fire, even though the warmth of the day still lingered in the air. She drifted off to sleep almost immediately, one tiny hand reaching out in the half-sleep of exhaustion, as if trying to hold on to something, anything. The feel of her hand on his mind lingered long after the flames had begun to crackle and reach for the chimney. Amos was a man well acquainted with solitude. The cabin's walls had long been silent, except for the rhythmic sound of his boots on the wooden floor and the wind, whispering through the cracks in the structure. But that night, as he sat at his table, the sound of her steady breathing pressed against the stillness. It was a strange thing, that breathing. He couldn't decide if it gave him a strange comfort or if it unsettled him more than anything. He poured himself whiskey, staring into the fire, wondering if he'd taken in a blessing or a burden. Morning came with an answer he had not expected. A shadow approached across the prairie, tall and unbending, and from it stepped a woman who carried herself with both exhaustion and pride. Her hair was long, braided with a simplicity, her eyes sharp, though rimmed with. She was Apache too, and shedded, not plead, as she stood at the foot of his porch. She looked at the child, then at Amos, and spoke in a voice low and certain. "By our traditions," she said, "the saves a child's life become us bound to her family forever." Amos let out a short, humorless laugh. He told her he had given food, nothing more, that no bond held him but the one's head. She did not flinch, did not even blink. She repeated her words, steady, astone, bound forever. It was not threat nor plea. It was fact as she knew it, and in that quiet certainty, Amos's felt ground shift beneath him. The child woke brightened by sleep, and toddled her mother. She laughed for the first time, the sound carrying across prairie like a bell. Amos had not heard such a sound in years, not since a boy his own life had been carved into. Something stirred in him, something dangerous and tender all atones. In the days that followed, the woman remained. Her name was Lozon. She gathered herbs near the creek, tended to a daughter, and spoke little. Amos told himself it was temporary, that they would leave once strength returned. Yet each dawn he found them still there. Thekabin no longer echoing with only his. He caught himself watching their girl as she followed him about, mimicking his every movement. He caught himself listening for the soft hum of Flozon's voice as she soothed her daughter to sleep. Mrs. Halbrook, Thrudo, from the next ranch, rode by one. She remarked with a sly smile that the Whitfield place had never looked so alive. Amos grunted in reply, but her words lingered like a burr under his skin. He had lived long without company, convincing himself he needed none. And no, now there was light spilling through the cracks of his walls. One evening a storm came down fierce, from mountains rain lashing against the roof. Amos climbed up to secure the loose boards, his boots slipping on through its shingles. He nearly lost his footing, the ground yawning below when a hand caught his arm. Lozon had come up the ladder after him, her grip firm, her eyes wide with fear. She held him until steadied, neither speaking. In that grasp he felt not just strength, but thewit of her fear for him, and it trattled him deeper than any fall could have. They returned inside, soaked and the girl curled against their hearth, safe and asleep. Lozon sat across from him, her hair damp, her gazoon readable. Amos poured water from the kettle, hands shaking more than he cared to admit. He realized, as the storm raged outside, that he had stepped into something far larger than he'd ever chosen. And when he laid down that night, staring at the ceiling beams, one truth nodded him harder than hunger ever had. He was no longer a man alone, and no matter how he tried to deny it, Theband had already taken root in him, like fire smouldering in dry grass, waiting for the wind. The prairie had a way of stretching time, of making days bleed into one another until weeks passed without notice. For Amos's life had once been a slow march of repetition, but now a dawn arrived with a sound that startled him with its sweetness. Fellow of a child riding a pony too small for work, but sturdy enough for joy. The little girl clung to the saddle horn, her braids flying, her face lit with a freedom she had nearly lost forever. Amos held the reins lightly, steadying her, the faintest of smiles tugging his. Lozon watched from the porch, her hands folded before her, a shadow of weariness in her eyes, but also pride. She had grown less a stranger than ever soft. Her movements were measured, every gesture shaped by survival and quiet resilience. Amos would catch himself, studying the way she moved through his cabin, kneeling to grind herbs, straightening to stir the kettle, each motion so precise it seemed choreographed by something older. He felt her strength, not the loud strength of men boasting in a saloon, but the unyielding kind that keeps a child alive when the world has turned cruel. Still, not all voices on the prairie welcomed this bond. One evening at the trading post, Amos heard Caleb Riggs speak with a sneer. So the mighty Whitfield feeds mouths, not his own now, taking in strays. Best be careful, or folks will start thinking you're soft. Amos bristled, saying nothing, but the words followed him home like burrs caught in wool. That night Ash sat by the fire, low, and spoke without looking at him. I do not stay for pity, nor do I chain myself to mercy. Her voice carried both pride and a tremor of pain. I will not be a burden. Amos wanted to answer, but the weight of her honesty left him silent. restless Harris before dawn the next day. Hessedled his horse and rode into town, his heart pulling him towards something could not yet name. He bought fabric dyed in soft earth tones for a dress, and a pouch of seeds for herbs she often searched for near the creek. The shopkeeper raised a brow, but asked no question. Amos rode back with the sun behind him, the gifts heavy in Hissedel bags, heavier still in what they met. When he placed them on the table, Lusanne's fingers brushed the cloth, as though it might vanish. She said nothing, but her eyes lifted to meet us, and in them he saw gratitude, laced with something fragile, something dangerous. Hope for a man who had built this life on solitude. It felt like stepping onto a ledge with no ground below. The days thickened with Amos found himself drawn into their small orbit, teaching the girl to whistle through her teeth, listening at night as lonesome lullabies that see Meadow stitch the darkness with light. The cabin had become less a shelter of wood and more a heart that beat with 3 lives instead of 1. He tried to tell himself it was temporary, yet each night found it harder to imagine waking Toslance again. One evening, the sky panned wide with stars, so clear they seemed close enough to touch. Lozen stepped out from the cabin, her shawl draped across her shoulders, the firelight behind her painting her silhouette in gold. She stood beside him without speaking, her gaze lifted to Thehaven's. Finally, her voice, low and uncertain, broke the stillness. At first, I stayed because tradition bound me, a dead ode. But now, she faltered. Now my heart does not stay out of duty. It stays out of choice. Amos felt the ground tilt beneath him. He turned to her, words catching in his throat. He had always believed himself unworthy of such confession, weathered by loneliness to deserve it. Yet here it was, laid before him under an endless sky. He reached for her hand, roughened by work, warm with life. The prairie is wide, he said, but without you and the girl, it is nothing but dust. In that moment, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, thick with everything they had not said, and everything still to come. The little girl burst from the doorway, then barefoot, clutching the hem of her dress. She laughed and ran to them, pressing her small hands into theirs, forcing them together. The 3 stood bound, not by accident, not by hunger, not by custom, but by something chosen freely. The horizon stretched around them, a lonely land made less lonely. The cabin glowed behind, a fragile beacon against the vast dark. Amos looked at Lozon, at the girl who clung to them both, and felt the truth settle deep in his bones. Some ties are given, but the ones that matter most are forgotten choice. And with that choice, the man Woe had once believed himself destined for solitude now stood on the threshold of a life remade. Above them, the stars burned steady, as if bearing witness to a covenant older than words, stronger than. Amos whispered into the night, not knowing if they heard that he would never again let the silence take them. And somewhere in the hush of Theperi, the wind carried that promise away into forever.